Snoop Dogg had faced his fair share of encounters with the law, but from the very start, this stop felt different. The afternoon had begun like any other, just him, his lowrider, and the city's rhythm flowing effortlessly around him. But when the red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror, he knew this wasn't just a routine traffic stop. The way the officers approached his car, the cold detachment behind their mirrored sunglasses, the smirks that barely concealed their true intent, it was clear they weren't here to ask questions. They were here to make accusations, to provoke, to set a trap. But if there was one thing Snoop understood better than most, it was how to read a situation, and he could see the corruption written all over this one. The only question was, would he let it slide or stand his ground? And if there's one thing the world knows about Snoop Dogg, it's that he's never been one to back down. The sun hung low over Los Angeles, painting golden streaks across the city streets as Snoop cruised down Crenshaw in his custom lowrider, the hydraulics humming with each subtle bounce. The bass from his latest track pulsed through the speakers, blending seamlessly with the familiar sounds of the neighborhood, kids weaving between cars on bikes, street vendors hustling on corners, and the distant wail of sirens cutting through the air like background noise in a city that never truly sleeps. For Snoop, this was home. This was peace. His windows were rolled down just enough to let the warm breeze drift through, carrying the sense of fresh street tacos and hot asphalt. He wasn't in a hurry. He never was. Just another day, another smooth ride to clear his mind after hours in the studio. But that calm vibe? It shattered the moment he saw those flashing lights in his rearview mirror. At first, he didn't react. He'd been here before. A traffic stop wasn't new to him. But something about the way that black and white cruiser was tailing him felt off. It wasn't the usual follow and pass scenario, they were sticking to him like glue. Too close. Too aggressive. He eased off the gas, letting the car roll to a smooth stop by the curb. And that's when he felt it. This wasn't just a routine stop. This was something else. The cruiser didn't just stop behind Snoop's lowrider, it loomed, like a shadow stretching too long in the fading afternoon sun. The flashing lights weren't just red and blue anymore, they painted the entire street in an aggressive, strobing glow that made the calm of just moments before feel like a distant memory. The rhythmic thump of Snoop's speakers was now competing with the thudding beat of his own heart, though his face remained the picture of calm behind his signature sunglasses. The car doors creaked open with an exaggerated slowness, like the officers were trying to drag the moment out, stretch the tension until it snapped. They wanted him to feel the weight of their presence. And Snoop felt it, but not in the way they expected. He wasn't new to this. He had seen this play out more times than he could count. But this time felt different. Two cops stepped out. The first was older, mid-40s, his face weathered, not from time but from a life of authority unchecked. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the lowrider's polished chrome, his jaw tight, the kind of tight that comes from years of thinking you own the space you occupy. His uniform was crisp, too crisp, like he wore it as armor, a badge not just pinned to his chest but stitched into his identity. The second cop was younger, maybe late 20s, with a lean build and a swagger that suggested he was still trying to prove something. His smirk wasn't just a facial expression, it was a weapon. It said, "We've done this before, and we'll do it again." He circled the car with slow, predatory steps, his eyes scanning every inch like he was looking for a reason to escalate. Not because there was one, but because he wanted there to be. Snoop kept his hands on the steering wheel, fingers tapping a slow, steady rhythm. He was calm, but not passive. He knew better than to give them a reason. But he also knew better than to let them think they had control. The older cop was the first to speak, his voice cutting through the thick air like a blade. "License and registration." "No, sir." "No, please." "Just an order," barked out like Snoop was already guilty of something they hadn't named yet. Snoop moved slowly, deliberately. He reached into the glove compartment with the ease of someone who had done this dance before. But he felt their eyes on him, sharp, watching, waiting for a wrong move that wasn't coming. He handed over his ID and registration without a word. The cop took them, glanced briefly, and then, in a move that felt more like a slap than anything else, tossed them back onto the dashboard like they were worthless. Snoop raised an eyebrow behind his shades. He didn't need to speak to let them know he caught that. Disrespect speaks louder than words. "You know why we stopped you?" the older cop asked, his tone laced with condescension, like the answer was obvious. Snoop's voice was smooth, steady. "Nope. But I got a feelin' you gonna tell me." The younger cop chuckled, circling the car like a shark, tapping on the windows, peering inside like he was searching for something, anything, to justify this stop. "We got reports of a vehicle matching this description involved in some suspicious activity," the older cop said, his words slow, deliberate, heavy with implication. Snoop exhaled, a slow breath that carried more patience than most people would have had in that moment. Suspicious activity. The phrase was vague enough to mean anything but specific enough to sound official. It was the kind of language cops used when they didn't have a real reason but wanted you to think they did. Suspicious activity, huh? Snoop echoed, his voice still calm, but there was a weight behind his words now. "That so?" The older cop leaned in closer, his face just inches from Snoop's window. His breath was hot against the cool air inside the car, his presence invasive, oppressive. "Why don't you step out of the car, and we'll have a little chat?" Snoop knew this moment. It was the pivot point, the line between staying in control and letting them take it. And he wasn't about to give it up. "I'm good right here," Snoop replied, his tone calm but firm. "Ain't nothin' illegal about drivin' home from work." The older cop's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to people saying no. Especially not people like Snoop. His hand drifted toward the cuffs on his belt, his body language shifting from professional to aggressive in a heartbeat. But before Snoop could process that shift, the younger cop made his move. Without warning, the passenger door flew open. The younger cop didn't ask, didn't explain, he just reached inside, his hands moving with a purpose that had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with control. He rifled through the glove compartment, under the seats, his movements frantic, almost desperate. He wasn't looking for evidence, he was looking for an excuse. Anything to justify what was happening. "Yo!" Snoop barked, his calm cracking just enough to let the heat through. "What the hell you doin'?" The older cop didn't flinch. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, threatening growl. "Step out of the car. Now." But Snoop wasn't about to fall into their trap. His heart was racing, but his mind was clear. He moved slow, pulling out his phone, his thumb hitting the record button in one smooth motion. The small red dot blinked to life on the screen, a silent witness to everything that was about to unfold. "You're being recorded," Snoop said flatly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "So, you might want to think twice about what you do next." For a split second, the older cop hesitated. It was brief, but Snoop saw it. They weren't as sure of themselves anymore. The younger cop froze mid-search, his hand still under the seat, like he was debating whether to pull out something, real or planted. But the camera changed the game. Now it wasn't just Snoop's word against theirs. It was evidence. As the confrontation played out, the neighborhood began to take notice. Heads appeared in windows, doors creaked open, and people started to gather on the sidewalk. Some were discreet, pretending to mind their own business while their phones quietly recorded. Others were more obvious, their cameras out, capturing every angle. Snoop could feel the shift in energy. This wasn't just about him anymore. The older cop noticed it too. His eyes flicked to the growing crowd, his confidence waning. The younger cop pulled his hand out of the car, empty, his smirk gone. He slammed the door shut harder than necessary, stepping back but keeping his hand near his holster. The bluff had failed. Snoop kept the camera steady, his voice cool and steady. "Looks like y'all ain't find what you was looking for, huh?" The older cop's jaw clenched, his authority slipping through his fingers like sand. "You're free to go," he muttered, his voice tight with frustration. But Snoop wasn't done. Not yet. The moment the younger cop swung open the passenger door without warning, the entire dynamic shifted. This wasn't just an overzealous officer on a power trip, this was a calculated move. Snoop recognized it instantly. The way the younger cop dove into the car, rifling through the glove compartment, digging under the seats, his hands moving with frantic precision, it wasn't about finding something illegal. It was about planting something if they needed to. Snoop's mind raced, but his face remained a mask of calm. He'd been in this game long enough to recognize a setup when he saw one. They were trying to bait him, trying to push him into reacting, into making a move they could twist into justification. But Snoop wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. "Yo!" Snoop's voice cut through the thick air, sharp enough to make the younger cop pause, but not enough to stop him. "What the hell you doing in my car?" The older cop leaned in closer, his face inches from Snoop's, his breath hot and laced with something that wasn't just authority, it was arrogance. He didn't flinch at Snoop's words. He didn't need to. He thought he was in control. "Step out of the car. Now." The words weren't a request. They were a threat wrapped in the thin veneer of a command. Snoop could feel the heat rising in his chest, the urge to snap back, to call them out for what they were doing. But he knew better. One wrong move, one wrong word, and they'd have the excuse they were looking for. Instead of reacting, Snoop moved slowly, deliberately, pulling his phone from his pocket with the kind of calm that spoke louder than any outburst ever could. His thumb hit the record button, the small red dot flashing to life on the screen. "You're being recorded," Snoop said, his voice low but steady, every word landing with the weight of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "So you might want to think twice about what you do next." For the first time, the older cop hesitated. It was just a flicker, a brief tightening of the jaw, a quick glance at the phone, but it was enough. Snoop saw it. They weren't as confident as they wanted him to believe. The younger cop froze mid-search, his hand still buried under the passenger seat. For a moment, it looked like he was considering pulling out something that wasn't his, planting evidence to justify the stop. But the camera changed everything. Now it wasn't just Snoop's word against theirs, it was proof. As the seconds stretched into what felt like hours, the energy on the street shifted. The usual background hum of the neighborhood, cars passing, people chatting, music spilling from open windows, faded into silence. People started to gather, their curiosity piqued by the flashing lights and the rising tension. Heads poked out from behind curtains, neighbors stepped onto porches, and passers-by slowed their steps, eyes locked on the unfolding scene. A few pulled out their phones, recording from different angles, ensuring that this wasn't just Snoop's fight anymore. It was the community's. The younger cop noticed the growing crowd and pulled his hand out of the car, empty. The cocky smirk he'd worn when they first approached had disappeared, replaced by a tight, uncomfortable expression. He slammed the door shut with more force than necessary, stepping back but keeping his hand near his holster, as if still hoping for an excuse to escalate. Snoop didn't flinch. He kept the camera steady, his voice calm but laced with something colder now. "Looks like y'all didn't find what you was looking for, huh?" The older cop's jaw clenched, his authority slipping like sand through his fingers. For a moment, it seemed like he might double down, push harder, try to regain control through sheer force. But the cameras changed the equation. They couldn't bury this story if it went wrong. "You're free to go," the older cop muttered, his voice tight with frustration, each word tasting bitter in his mouth. But Snoop wasn't finished. "Not yet." "Nah," Snoop said, his voice rising just enough for the crowd to hear, for the cameras to catch every word. "Y'all thought you could pull some shady shit 'cause I'm just another black man in a nice car. But guess what? You picked the wrong one today. The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices low but powerful, a wave of solidarity rolling down the street. The cops knew they had lost. There was no salvaging this. They climbed back into their cruiser, slamming the doors with more force than necessary, and peeled off down the street, their lights still flashing but their authority in shambles. But Snoop stayed right where he was, phone still recording, his eyes locked on the spot where the cruiser had disappeared. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He knew how these stories played out when there weren't cameras rolling. He knew how quickly narratives could be twisted, how easily the truth could be buried under official statements and legal jargon. But not this time. This time, the whole world would see. As he finally put his phone down, Snoop exhaled, the adrenaline still humming beneath his skin. He hadn't just stood his ground for himself, he'd done it for everyone who'd ever been in his position, who didn't have the platform, the voice, the audience to fight back. And he knew one thing for sure, this was just the beginning. The red recording dot on Snoop's phone felt like a silent siren in the thick air. The power shift wasn't loud, it was subtle, creeping in like a tide the officers hadn't expected. For years, they'd relied on silence, on isolation, on the fact that these kinds of encounters usually happened in the shadows. But now, the whole world was watching. Snoop kept the phone steady, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses. The older cop, still hovering near the driver's side window, stiffened. His eyes flicked toward the phone, and for the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty. Not fear, just hesitation. And in moments like this, hesitation was all Snoop needed. You know this is illegal, right? Snoop's voice was calm, even, but each word was heavy with undeniable authority. Searchin, my car without cause, Harrison, me for nothing. You think that badge means you untouchable? The younger cop, still hovering near the passenger door, opened his mouth to speak, but the words never came. He could feel the weight of the eyes around him, the growing crowd, the recording phones, and Snoop's unwavering gaze. By now, the neighborhood wasn't just watching. They were invested. This wasn't just Snoop's fight anymore. It was every person who had ever been stopped without cause, every voice that had been silenced before it could tell its story. From across the street, someone shouted, "We see you. You ain't gonna get away with this." Another voice joined in, "That's Snoop, man. They messin' with Snoop." And just like that, the officers weren't facing one man, they were facing an entire community. The older cop's jaw tightened. He knew how this looked. And perception was everything now. The younger cop stepped back from the car, his hands hovering near his belt, unsure of whether to escalate or retreat. But Snoop knew exactly what he was doing. Snoop leaned slightly out of the window, his phone still recording. His voice was louder now, not shouting, but carrying, strong, clear, impossible to ignore. "You see what's happening here," he said, his words directed at the crowd now, but his eyes never leaving the officers. "This is what they do when they think nobody's watching. But today, everybody's watching." The younger cop shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado fading with every passing second. The older cop, realizing the situation had spiraled out of his control, took a step back, his mouth set in a hard line. "You're free to go," he muttered, the words tasting bitter as they left his mouth. But Snoop wasn't letting them off that easy. "Nah," Snoop replied, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Y'all don't get to walk away like that. You thought you could pull some shady shit 'cause I'm just another black man in a nice car. But guess what? You picked the wrong one today." The crowd erupted in murmurs of agreement, some clapping, others recording even closer now. The officers knew they had lost, not just control, but the narrative. They climbed back into their cruiser, slamming the doors harder than necessary, and peeled off down the street, their tires screeching as if trying to erase their own embarrassment. But Snoop. Snoop sat there for a moment longer, letting the reality of what had just happened settle in the air. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the squad car disappeared around the corner, people began to approach Snoop's car, their faces a mix of relief and solidarity. "You good, man?" one guy asked, his phone still in hand, the screen blinking with the recording that had just captured the whole thing. Snoop nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "Yeah. But it ain't about me. It's about making sure this don't happen to the next brother who don't got a camera rollin'. A woman nearby, holding her young son's hand, added, "We saw the whole thing. They thought they could get away with it, but not today." The energy wasn't just supportive, it was charged. This wasn't just a story people would forget tomorrow. It was fuel for a conversation that wasn't going to die down. Before Snoop could even drive off, the first video hit social media. A short clip, no more than 30 seconds, but it captured everything that mattered: the officers searching his car without cause, Snoop calmly asserting his rights, the crowd growing, the final confrontation. The caption read, "They tried to set up Snoop Dogg. They didn't expect him to record it." Within minutes, it was being shared, retweeted, and posted across platforms. Comments poured in. This happens every day to people who don't have Snoop's platform. Imagine how many times this happens when nobody's recording. Snoop Dogg just gave a masterclass in staying calm under pressure. And just like that, the narrative belonged to Snoop. By the time Snoop pulled into his driveway that night, his phone was blowing up. Calls from friends, texts from journalists, DMs from people sharing their own stories. The video had gone viral. News outlets were already running headlines. Snoop Dogg stands his ground against unlawful police stop, entire incident caught on camera. But Snoop wasn't thinking about the views or the headlines. He was thinking about the people who didn't have a platform, who didn't have a crowd to back them up, who had faced similar situations and didn't walk away with a video to tell their side. He sat back, exhaling deeply, staring at the city skyline. This wasn't just about him anymore. And he wasn't about to let it stop here. As Snoop sat in his lowrider, the engine idling softly beneath him, the tension from the confrontation still hung in the air like smoke. The officers had peeled off down the street, but their presence lingered, a shadow that couldn't be shaken off so easily. The crowd that had gathered was slowly dispersing, people exchanging glances, nods, and quiet words of solidarity before heading back to their lives. But Snoop knew that this moment, this very specific moment, wasn't going to fade into the background like all the others. He reached over, stopping the recording on his phone, but he didn't put it away. He just stared at the screen for a second, watching the small red dot disappear, replaced by the timestamp of the video. Evidence. But more than that, proof. Proof of what had happened, and more importantly, proof that they had tried to get away with it. The street was calm again, but it wasn't the same calm as before. It was the calm before a different kind of storm. Snoop didn't have to be the first one to post the video. The neighborhood had already handled that. By the time he pulled out of his parking spot and eased back onto the street, his phone was buzzing in the cup holder beside him. Ping. 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 Text after text, notification after notification, flooded his screen. He glanced down at a red notification bubble from Instagram, 50 new tags. Twitter was blowing up, too, and his DMs were overflowing. He pulled over a few blocks away, curiosity getting the better of him. When he tapped on the first video tag, he saw it. A 30-second clip, shot from across the street. It showed the younger cop rifling through his car, the older cop leaning into his window, and Snoop, calm as ever, holding his phone up to record. The caption read, "They tried to set up Snoop Dogg. But they didn't expect him to catch it on camera." He scrolled down, thousands of likes, hundreds of comments. People weren't just watching, they were reacting. This happens every day to people without a platform. If this is how they treat Snoop Dogg, imagine how they treat the rest of us. They messed with the wrong one today. And then came the retweets, the reposts, the shares. The story was out. And it wasn't going anywhere. By the time Snoop made it home, the video wasn't just circulating in his neighborhood, it was trending worldwide. News outlets were picking it up. Headlines flashed across his notifications. Snoop Dogg confronted by police in unlawful stop, entire incident recorded. Snoop Dogg stands his ground against officers in shocking viral video. Police overreach caught on camera, Snoop Dogg becomes the face of resistance. It wasn't just entertainment news anymore. It was everywhere, from local stations to major networks. But Snoop wasn't thinking about the media frenzy. He was thinking about the people who didn't have a platform, who couldn't record their encounters, who faced this kind of harassment every day without anyone stepping in. He sank into his couch, staring at the ceiling as his phone continued to buzz relentlessly beside him. The adrenaline was wearing off, but the weight of what had happened wasn't going anywhere. As the hours passed, Snoop's name became a rallying cry. People weren't just sharing the video, they were sharing their own stories. Twitter threads popped up from people who had experienced the same kind of harassment. Stories of unlawful stops, illegal searches, and cops overstepping their authority filled his feed. I was pulled over last month for matching a description. Same thing happened. No camera, no justice. They tried this on me last year. I wasn't as lucky as Snoop. This is every black man's reality. The only difference is, Snoop's famous enough to shine a light on it. Activists jumped in, calling for accountability. Civil rights organizations shared the video, demanding investigations into the officers involved. Even celebrities began reposting the clip, adding their voices to the growing chorus. Snoop scrolled through it all, absorbing every word, every story. It wasn't just about him anymore. It didn't take long for the police department to respond. By the next morning, an official statement was plastered across their social media accounts. We are aware of the video circulating online involving Mr. Calvin Broadus, known as Snoop Dogg. We take these matters seriously and are conducting an internal review to ensure proper procedures were followed. We remain committed to transparency and fairness in all community interactions. Snoop stared at the statement, his jaw tightening. Internal review. He'd heard that before. It was code for we'll pretend to look into it and hope it goes away. But this time, it wasn't going away. Snoop opened his phone, hit record, and stared straight into the camera. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the fire behind his words. You know, they always say they're gonna review things when they get caught. But we know what that means. They'll sweep it under the rug, say it was a misunderstanding, and move on like nothing happened. But I ain't lettin' this one slide. 'Cause if they'll do it to me, they'll do it to anybody. And I ain't just here for me, I'm here for the ones who don't got a camera, who don't got a platform, who don't got the crowd behind them. We ain't lettin' this go. He posted the video, and within minutes, it exploded. The internet didn't just agree, they demanded action. By the end of the week, protests were organized in front of the police station. People carried signs with quotes from Snoop's video, their voices loud and unified. We see you. This stops now. Not just Snoop, all of us. What started as a single traffic stop had become a movement. And Snoop wasn't just the face of it, he was the voice that refused to be silenced. As he stood in front of the crowd at the first rally, looking out at the sea of people who had gathered to demand justice, he realized something. This wasn't just about that day. It was about every day. And Snoop. He wasn't backing down. As the days turned into weeks, the viral buzz surrounding Snoop Dogg's confrontation didn't fade, it grew. What started as a routine traffic stop had unraveled into something much bigger. This wasn't just about Snoop. It wasn't even just about corrupt cops. It was about a system that thrived in the shadows, that counted on silence, on people looking the other way. But that day, the world didn't look away. Snoop's calm defiance, his refusal to be baited, and his ability to flip the power dynamic without lifting a finger had struck a chord far beyond his neighborhood. People saw themselves in that moment, the same fear, the same frustration, the same sense of helplessness, but Snoop had shown them that standing your ground could make a difference. And it wasn't just about cameras or going viral. It was about exposing the truth. The truth that for every time someone like Snoop could capture injustice on camera, there were countless others who didn't have that chance. This was their story too. The police department's weak statements and half-hearted promises of internal reviews weren't enough. The people demanded more. Accountability. Transparency. Change. And Snoop. He didn't just go back to his life, back to his music, pretending like it was just another headline. He leaned into the movement, using his platform to uplift voices that had been ignored for too long. Because if they could try to silence him, they could do it to anyone. The incident might have started with flashing lights in a rearview mirror, but it ended with a message that echoed far beyond that street in LA. We see you. We hear you. And we're not backing down. Snoop's story was more than a confrontation, it was a reminder that sometimes, all it takes is one person to refuse to move, to stand firm in the face of injustice, and to show the world that the fight isn't over until we say it is.